A frustrated cop pulls over an elderly black woman for a broken taillight, but what starts as a routine stop takes a shocking turn. Suspicious of the bags in her back seat, he accuses her of theft and arrests her, thinking he's made an impressive bust. But when she walks into the station later that evening, his world is turned upside down. Because she's not just any woman, she's his new boss, with a mission to expose the very injustices he's been blind to. How will he handle the truth about who she is? And what happens when her powerful story of resilience forces him to confront his own past? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets as Officer Mike Turner drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Another shift crawling by with nothing to show for it. He glanced at his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes, fighting back a yawn as the monotony of patrol duty weighed on him. 3 more hours, he muttered, scanning the quiet neighborhood. Perfect lawns and pristine houses seemed to mock his ambition, their manicured hedges and spotless driveways a constant reminder of his mundane assignments. 6 months on the force, and he was still stuck doing routine patrols while other officers got the exciting assignments downtown where the real action happened. A silver sedan caught his eye, specifically its broken taillight glowing dimly in the fading sunlight. Mike straightened in his seat, his pulse quickening as adrenaline pushed away his boredom. Finally, something to break the monotony. He flipped on his lights and watched with satisfaction as the car pulled over smoothly to the curb, its turn signal blinking precisely 3 times. Mike approached the vehicle, his hand resting casually on his belt as he'd practiced countless times in the academy. The window rolled down with a soft whir to reveal an elderly black woman, her silver hair neatly styled in waves, wearing a crisp blue blouse that spoke of careful presentation. "License and registration, ma'am," Mike said, trying to sound authoritative despite his youth. "Of course, officer." Her voice was calm and clear as she handed over the documents, maintaining steady eye contact. "I'm Grace Morgan. Is there a problem?" Mike checked her license, holding it up to catch the sunlight. Everything looked in order, but something about her composure irked him. Most people showed at least a little nervousness during traffic stops. A trembling hand, a wavering voice, something. His eyes drifted to the back seat where several shopping bags sat neatly arranged. "Been shopping today, Mrs. Morgan?" He leaned slightly closer to the window, trying to peer into the bags. "Yes, I have. I'm visiting family in town and picked up some gifts." She smiled politely, but Mike detected what he thought was a hint of condescension in her tone, as if she were humoring an overeager child. "That's quite a lot of bags," he pressed, his earlier frustration finding a target in this too composed woman. "Where exactly did you make these purchases?" "At the Riverside Mall," Grace replied, her hands remaining steady on the steering wheel. "I have receipts for everything if you'd like to see them." Mike's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his temple. Her measured responses felt rehearsed, suspicious. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her perfect composure. "May I ask why, officer?" "Ma'am, exit the vehicle now." Mike's voice rose, his hand instinctively moving closer to his belt. "We've had reports of shoplifting in the area." "I assure you, officer, I've done nothing wrong." Despite her protest, Grace carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, her movements deliberate and dignified in her sensible shoes. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Mike's heart raced with the thrill of possible action, his earlier boredom forgotten. Finally, a chance to prove himself to the department. "This is unnecessary," Grace said firmly, though she complied with graceful dignity. "I'm a retired school teacher, and I have receipts for every purchase in those bags." Mike ignored her words as he pulled out his handcuffs, the metal catching the late afternoon light. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he secured the cuffs around her wrists, Mike felt a surge of pride mixed with righteous certainty. This would show the department he had good instincts, that he could spot suspicious behavior others might miss. He helped Grace into the back of his patrol car, noting how she held her head high despite the circumstances, her posture remaining arrow straight. Driving toward the station, Mike caught glimpses of his passenger in the rearview mirror. Grace sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable in the golden light of the setting sun that streamed through the cage partition. Her continued composure only reinforced his conviction that he'd made the right call. Nobody could be this calm unless they were hiding something, he told himself. Professional criminals always kept their cool. The suburban streets rolled by as Mike imagined the praise he'd receive back at the station. Finally, a chance to be more than just the rookie on patrol, to prove he had what it took to handle real police work. He'd done what good cops were supposed to do, trust their gut and take action. The weight of his badge felt heavier, more significant as he drove through the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. Mike strode into the station, his chest puffed with pride as he guided Grace through the entrance. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the booking area where several officers milled about, completing their evening paperwork. The familiar smell of coffee and printer ink hung in the air, mixing with the staleness of the precinct's aging ventilation system. "Right this way, ma'am," Mike said, his voice carrying a hint of smugness. "Let's get you processed." He gestured toward the booking desk with an exaggerated sweep of his arm. Grace followed quietly, her posture straight and dignified despite the circumstances. Her heels clicked steadily against the worn linoleum floor. As Mike began the booking process, Officer Rodriguez glanced up from her desk, her eyes widening slightly. She nudged Officer Chen, who looked equally concerned. The two exchanged meaningful looks across their desks. "Name?" Mike asked, typing with 2 fingers, the keyboard clacking under his heavy-handed strokes. "Grace Morgan?" she replied evenly, her calm voice a stark contrast to Mike's aggressive typing. "And what were you doing in our jurisdiction today, Ms. Morgan?" Mike's tone dripped with condescension. He leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Before Grace could answer, the station's double doors swung open with a loud creak. Captain James Reynolds walked in, his face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. The room fell silent, save for the quiet hum of computers and the distant ringing of phones. "Everyone, gather round," Captain Reynolds called out, his commanding voice filling the space. "I have an important announcement." Mike continued typing, barely looking up. His fingers moved deliberately across the keyboard. "Just a moment, Captain. Almost unbooking this suspect." "Officer Turner." Captain Reynolds' voice carried a sharp edge that cut through the air like a knife. "Step away from the computer. Now." Something in the captain's tone made Mike's stomach twist. He looked up, noticing for the first time how every other officer had stopped what they were doing. Papers hung forgotten in hands, coffee cups paused halfway to lips. "I'd like to introduce everyone to Grace Morgan," Captain Reynolds continued, moving to stand beside Grace. His usual stern expression had softened slightly. "She's our new interim chief, appointed by the mayor to help implement much-needed reforms in our department." The room erupted in hushed whispers, a wave of murmurs spreading from desk to desk. Mike's fingers froze over the keyboard as the blood drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The computer screen's harsh glow seemed to mock him. Grace stepped forward, adjusting her jacket with practiced ease. The fabric rustled softly in the tense silence. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds. I had hoped to introduce myself under different circumstances." Her eyes swept the room, commanding attention without raising her voice. "But perhaps this evening's events highlight exactly why I'm here." Mike's ears burned as he felt every eye in the room turn to him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his collar suddenly felt 2 sizes too small. "Our department needs significant changes," Grace continued, her voice steady and measured. "Changes in how we approach our community, how we handle routine interactions, and most importantly, how we check our own biases." She paused, meeting Mike's gaze briefly, her eyes both stern and knowing. "Every officer in this room will be held accountable for their actions, starting today." The silence in the room was deafening. Even the usual background noise seemed muted. Mike stared at his half-completed booking form, the cursor blinking mockingly on the screen. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a knot of shame and anger in his stomach. The partially filled form glared back at him, each letter a reminder of his monumental mistake. "Captain Reynolds, would you show me to my office?" Grace asked, smoothing her jacket once more. We have much to discuss. As Grace and the captain left the room, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, Mike remained rooted to his spot, unable to meet the eyes of his fellow officers. His hands trembled slightly as he reached to close the incomplete booking file, the mouse clicking loudly in the awkward silence. The sound seemed to emphasize the finality of his humiliation. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Grace's new office as Mike knocked on the door, his knuckles barely making contact with the wood. The gentle hum of the building's air conditioning filled the quiet hallway. "Come in, Officer Turner," Grace called out, her voice carrying clearly through the door. Mike entered, his shoulders tense and jaw clenched. The office looked different from when the previous chief occupied it. Grace had already added personal touches, a small potted plant on the windowsill, its leaves reaching toward the sunlight, a framed photo of what appeared to be her family gathered at a lakeside picnic, and several community service awards mounted proudly on the freshly painted wall. The room somehow felt both more welcoming and more intimidating than before. "Please have a seat," Grace gestured to the chair across from her desk. Her voice was professional but carried unmistakable authority, the kind that commanded respect without having to demand it. Mike sat down stiffly, avoiding direct eye contact, his fingers drumming nervously against his uniform pants. "You wanted to see me, Chief Morgan?" "Yes." Grace folded her hands on the desk, her silver wedding band catching the morning light. "I've been reviewing department initiatives, and I've made a decision regarding your role going forward." Mike shifted uncomfortably in the chair, the leather creaking beneath him. "You'll be heading up our new diversity and community engagement initiative," Grace continued, sliding a folder across her desk. "This will involve reviewing civilian complaints against officers and implementing programs to rebuild trust with our community members. We need someone who understands both sides of the equation." "What?" Mike's face flushed red, the color creeping up his neck. "With all due respect, Chief, this feels like punishment for what, Officer Turner?" Grace's steady gaze met his, her dark eyes unwavering. "For following your instincts, or for letting your biases cloud your judgment?" Mike's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish out of water. "This isn't punishment," Grace explained, her tone firm but not unkind, leaning back slightly in her chair. "This is an opportunity for growth. The incident yesterday highlighted exactly why we need this initiative. Sometimes our greatest learning comes from our most uncomfortable moments." "But I'm a patrol officer," Mike protested, his voice rising slightly. "I should be out there doing real police work, not stuck behind a desk reading complaints." Grace leaned forward slightly, her presence filling the space between them. "Understanding the community we serve is real police work, Officer Turner. Every complaint tells a story. Every interaction shapes how our citizens view law enforcement." She paused meaningfully, letting her words sink in, "as I'm sure you can appreciate from our interaction yesterday." Mike's face burned hotter, the tips of his ears turning crimson. "That was different. I was just doing my job." "And now I'm asking you to do this job," Grace cut in, her tone brooking no argument. "The first community meeting is scheduled for next week. I expect a preliminary action plan on my desk by Wednesday. This isn't optional, Officer Turner." Mike stood up, barely containing his anger, the chair scraping against the floor. "Yes, ma'am," he said through gritted teeth, his badge gleaming dully in the morning light. As he left the station, the morning sun now fully risen and beating down on the parking lot, his eyes caught the newly posted bulletin board announcement, "Community Engagement Initiative, Building Trust Together." Below it, in smaller text, was his name listed as Program Coordinator, the fresh ink seeming to mock him. Mike stared at the notice, his stomach churning with a mixture of resentment and dread, his fingers unconsciously curling into fists at his sides. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he joined the force. Not by a long shot. The bell above Joe's Diner chimed as Mike pushed through the glass door. The familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions filled his nose. In the corner booth, Sergeant Ryan Doyle sat nursing a steaming cup, his weathered face lighting up as he spotted Mike. "There's my boy," Doyle called out, waving him over. Mike slid into the vinyl booth, his uniform creasing at the knees. A waitress appeared, coffee pot in hand, and filled a fresh mug for him. "You look like you've been through hell," Doyle said, studying Mike's face. Mike wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "You have no idea, Sarge." His voice cracked slightly. "This new chief, she's got it out for me." "Grace Morgan," Doyle said, his tone carefully neutral. He stirred his coffee slowly. "Tell me everything." Mike launched into the story: the traffic stop, the arrest, the humiliating revelation at the station. His words tumbled out faster and faster as he described Grace's punishment assignment. "Community engagement initiative?" Doyle's eyebrows rose. "That's a career killer if I've ever heard one." "Exactly," Mike leaned forward. "She's trying to make an example out of me." Doyle set his cup down with a gentle clink. "Listen, kid, I've heard stories about Morgan. She's got a reputation for coming into departments and turning them upside down. Claims she's fighting for reform, but really?" He shook his head. "She's got an agenda." "What do you mean?" "Let's just say she's left a trail of good officers' careers in ruins. Always finds something wrong, always pushes for changes that nobody asked for." Doyle's voice dropped lower. "Between you and me, she's got a chip on her shoulder from some arrest years back. Now she's on a crusade." Mike felt his anger solidifying into something harder. "So what am I supposed to do?" "Watch your back," Doyle said, reaching across to pat Mike's hand. "Document everything. Don't give her any ammunition. And remember, we take care of our own around here." The word settled over Mike like a familiar blanket. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered doubts he couldn't quite silence. As the evening light faded outside the diner's windows, Mike stood to leave. Doyle's warnings played on repeat in his thoughts, mixing with memories of Grace's steady gaze and unwavering composure. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the station's conference room as officers filed in, their boots squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. Mike slumped into a chair near the back, crossing his arms. Around him, whispered conversations created a steady buzz of discontent. "Can you believe this?" Officer Martinez muttered to his left. "Another reform crusader thinking she can change everything overnight." Mike nodded, but his stomach churned uncomfortably. 2 days had passed since his disastrous traffic stop, and the memory still made his cheeks burn. The room fell silent as Grace Morgan entered. She wore a crisp navy blazer and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Thank you all for being here." She moved to the front of the room, setting down a thin folder. "We're here to discuss changes that will strengthen our department and our relationship with the community we serve." Several officers shifted in their seats. Mike noticed a few eye rolls but kept his expression neutral. Grace began outlining statistics, complaint numbers, demographic data, community trust ratings. The facts were stark, presented without accusation but impossible to ignore. Mike found himself studying his hands, unable to meet her steady gaze. "But numbers only tell part of the story," Grace continued, her tone softening. "Let me share something personal." The room stilled. Even the skeptics leaned forward slightly. "When I was 16, Grace began, I was arrested walking home from the library. The officer claimed I matched the description of someone who had shoplifted from a nearby store." Mike's head snapped up. The parallel to his own recent actions hit him like a physical blow. "I spent 6 hours in custody before they realized their mistake," Grace continued. "No apology, no acknowledgement of error. Just a teenage girl, terrified and alone, wondering why the people meant to protect her had caused such harm." Mike's throat tightened. He thought of the shopping bags in Grace's car, his immediate assumptions, the satisfaction he'd felt leading her into booking. "That experience could have left me bitter," Grace said. "Instead, it showed me where change was needed most. I joined law enforcement because I believed the best way to fix a broken system was from within." The silence in the room felt heavy. Mike glanced around, seeing thoughtful expressions on faces that had been skeptical minutes before. Even Officer Martinez had uncrossed his arms. "This initiative isn't about punishment," Grace continued. It's about growth, about ensuring no one else has to experience what I did, about making us better officers and better servants of our community. Mike stared at the floor, his earlier defensiveness crumbling under the weight of understanding. Everything he'd dismissed as targeting or punishment suddenly looked different through the lens of Grace's story. As the meeting concluded, officers rose slowly, the usual post-meeting chatter subdued. Mike remained seated, feeling anchored to his chair by the gravity of his realizations. When he finally stood to leave, he felt Grace's eyes on him but couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. Mike slouched into the station at 7 a.m. sharp, his footsteps heavy against the worn linoleum floor. The early morning silence felt oppressive as he made his way to the records room, where boxes of civilian complaints awaited his attention. "Here's your access card," said Linda from administration, sliding a key card across her desk. Her smile seemed almost pitying. "The files are organized by date. Chief Morgan wants you to start with the most recent ones." Mike snatched the card without responding. Inside the cramped records room, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he pulled the first box from the shelf. The cardboard was dusty, filled with manila folders stuffed with complaint forms. "What a waste of time," he muttered, flipping through the first few cases. Rudeness during a traffic stop, excessive force during an arrest. He rolled his eyes at each one, making dismissive notes in the margins. 3 hours and 2 coffee breaks later, Mike froze. A familiar name jumped out at him, his own. The complaint was from 6 months ago, filed by James Wilson, a young black man Mike had arrested for loitering outside a convenience store. Mike's throat felt dry as he read Wilson's account. "Officer Turner slammed me against the wall without warning. I told him I was waiting for my sister to pick me up, but he wouldn't listen." The memory came flooding back. The late-night call, his irritation at what he'd seen as another troublemaker, the satisfaction he'd felt booking Wilson into holding. The complaint had been dismissed after a cursory review. "I was following procedure," Mike whispered to himself, but the words rang hollow. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the file. Through the glass walls of her office, Grace watched Mike's reaction. After a moment, she stepped out. "Officer Turner, a word, please." Mike trudged into her office, avoiding her steady gaze. "How are you finding the review process?" Grace asked, her voice measured and calm. "These complaints are mostly nothing," Mike said defensively. "People just looking to cause trouble." Grace leaned forward slightly. "Every complaint represents someone's lived experience with our department, Officer Turner. Their truth matters, whether we want to acknowledge it or not." Mike's jaw clenched. "Is that all?" "For now," Grace replied quietly. "But I expect a thorough review of all cases, including your own." Mike stormed out of the station, letting the door slam behind him. The morning sun was harsh in his eyes as he paced the parking lot, his chest tight with emotions he refused to name. The file with Wilson's complaint seemed to burn in his memory, demanding attention he wasn't ready to give. Mike's shoulders slumped as he trudged toward his locker, eager to end this miserable Monday. The station was quiet, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and distant keyboard clicks breaking the silence. He twisted his combination lock with practiced movements, his mind still dwelling on that complaint file with his name on it. As the locker door creaked open, a white envelope fluttered to the floor. Mike frowned, bending to pick it up. His name was typed on the front. No return address, no signature. "What the hell?" he muttered, tearing it open. His eyes scanned the single page inside. "Officer Turner, your arrest of James Wilson wasn't just a routine stop, and you know it. I was there that night. I saw how you treated him, how you ignored his explanation about waiting for his sister. You never even checked his story. This isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. We all see it, but most stay quiet. Not anymore. You have a chance to be part of real change under Chief Morgan's leadership, but first you need to face your own actions. The department needs accountability, not defensiveness. Think about that next time you dismiss a civilian complaint as trivial." Mike's hand shook as he reached the end. Heat crept up his neck as he spun around, scanning the locker room. Officer Chen was changing by his locker, and Rodriguez was tying his shoes nearby. "Hey," Mike called out, his voice sharp. "Either of you leave this in my locker?" Both officers looked up, confused. "What are you talking about?" Rodriguez asked. "This letter. Someone's trying to mess with me." Mike waved the paper. "Was it you? Or did Morgan put you up to this?" Chen shook his head. "Man, I don't know what you're talking about. Nobody here is out to get you." Mike crumpled the letter in his fist, shoving it into his jacket pocket. His heart raced as he slammed his locker shut and stormed toward the exit. In his car, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, the anonymous writer's words echoing in his head. "You need to face your own actions." The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Mike followed Grace through the double doors. Folding chairs filled the room, arranged in neat rows facing a simple podium. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the diverse crowd of about 50 people, their expressions ranging from wary to openly hostile. Mike tugged at his collar, suddenly feeling suffocated by his uniform. He hung back near the entrance while Grace made her way to the front, her steps measured and confident. The whispers and sideways glances from the crowd made his skin prickle. Grace took her place behind the podium, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight," she began, her voice warm but firm. "I know it takes courage to come forward and share your experiences with law enforcement. Your stories matter, and they will help shape the changes we need to make." One by one, community members stepped up to the microphone. A young mother described being pulled over for no apparent reason while her children watched from the back seat. A college student shared how officers had dismissed his harassment complaint. Each story hit Mike like a physical blow, but he maintained a neutral expression. Then an elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses approached the microphone. "3 years ago, I was waiting for my grandson outside his school," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "An officer approached me, accused me of loitering. I tried to explain, showed him my grandson's picture in my wallet. But he wouldn't listen." Mike's stomach dropped. He remembered that day, the man in the navy sweater, the school parking lot, the way he dismissed the explanation as a likely story. "He handcuffed me right there, in front of my grandson and all those other children," the man continued. "Do you know what it's like to have your 8-year-old grandson see you treated like a criminal? To have him ask why the police officer was so mean to his grandpa?" Mike's face burned with shame. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear from the accusing stares and knowing looks. Grace's eyes found him in the crowd, her expression unreadable but intense. The meeting continued with more stories, but Mike barely heard them. His mind kept returning to that day, seeing it through new eyes. He'd written it off as just another arrest, but here was the human cost of his actions laid bare before him. As the meeting drew to a close, Grace thanked everyone for their bravery in sharing their experiences. Mike watched the elderly man gather his coat and shuffle toward the exit, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between them. The station was in chaos when Mike pushed through the front doors Wednesday morning. A crowd of officers huddled around Officer Martinez's computer, their faces illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Angry murmurs and heated debates filled the normally quiet space. "Did you see this?" Officer Chen called out to Mike, waving him over. "It's Brad. Video's going viral." Mike squeezed between his colleagues to watch the shaky cell phone footage. His stomach dropped as he recognized Officer Brad Kemp, a veteran officer known for his aggressive tactics. In the video, Kemp had a young man pinned face down on the sidewalk, his knee pressing into the man's back. The suspect wasn't resisting, but Kemp continued to apply pressure, ignoring the man's desperate pleas that he couldn't breathe. "Media's having a field day with this one," someone muttered. "It's being taken out of context," Sergeant Doyle argued, his face flushed. "You don't see what happened before the video started." The debate grew more heated as officers took sides. Mike stood back, watching his colleagues argue. The knot in his stomach tightened as he recognized many of Kemp's defensive tactics in his own past behavior. Grace's voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone in the conference room, now!" The officers filed in, tension thick in the air. Grace stood at the front, her expression stern but composed. "By now, you've all seen the video involving Officer Kemp. Effective immediately, He is suspended pending a full internal investigation. Angry protests erupted from several senior officers. "You can't do this," Lieutenant Parker shouted. "He's a good cop with 20 years of service." "This is a witch hunt," another officer added. Grace raised her hand, silencing the room. "This isn't up for debate. Accountability isn't optional in this department. Not anymore." Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he watched the clash unfold. Part of him wanted to speak up, to acknowledge that Kemp's actions were clearly excessive, but loyalty to his fellow officers kept him silent, even as Grace's words resonated with uncomfortable truth. "We cannot expect community trust if we don't hold ourselves accountable," Grace continued, her voice firm but measured. "Officer Kemp's actions violated department policy and basic human dignity. That's not protecting and serving, that's abuse of power." The room crackled with tension as officers began filing out. Grace's eyes met Mike's for a brief moment, her gaze carrying a clear challenge. Mike looked away quickly, gathered his things, and headed back to his desk, the weight of his silence pressing down on him like a physical burden. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds in Grace's office as Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been dreading this meeting since the morning's chaos over the viral video. "What are your thoughts on what happened with Officer Kemp?" Grace asked, her voice calm but direct. Mike cleared his throat. "Well, you know how these videos can be misleading. We don't always see the full context." "I'm asking for your honest opinion, Mike, not the department line." He stared at his hands, avoiding her steady gaze. "I mean, protocol was followed mostly. Maybe things got a little heated, but..." Grace leaned forward slightly. "Let's talk about protocols and assumptions. Like the night you pulled me over." Mike's jaw tightened. "That was different. I had reasonable suspicion." "Did you?" Grace interrupted gently. "What made you suspicious of an elderly woman with shopping bags?" "The broken taillight? Was the broken taillight why you asked me to step out of the car, or was it something else?" Mike felt heat rising in his neck. "Look, I followed procedure. You matched a description." "What description exactly?" Grace's voice remained measured. "An older black woman driving home with shopping bags? Help me understand what made you escalate that stop." Mike opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For the first time, he couldn't find a satisfactory answer. "When you saw those shopping bags," Grace continued, "what assumptions did you make? What story did you tell yourself?" The silence stretched between them as Mike replayed that evening in his mind. He remembered his frustration with the quiet shift, his eagerness to prove himself, and the immediate suspicion when he saw the bags. He started, then faltered. "I was doing my job." "Were you?" Grace asked softly. "Or were you letting preconceptions guide your actions?" Mike felt the familiar surge of defensiveness, but something else nagged at him, a creeping doubt he couldn't quite shake. "Sometimes," Grace said, "the hardest part of growth is acknowledging our own biases. They're like invisible glasses we wear, distorting how we see the world without us even realizing it." Mike stood abruptly, needing to escape her penetrating gaze. "I should get back to work." Grace nodded, not pushing further. "Think about what I've said, Mike. Really think about it." Later, sitting in his car after his shift, Mike couldn't stop Grace's words from echoing in his head. The certainty he'd felt that night seemed less solid now, like sand slipping through his fingers. For the first time, he allowed himself to question whether his instincts were something else entirely. Mike sat at the cramped desk in the records room, surrounded by stacks of manila folders. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he mechanically flipped through complaint after complaint. His mind wandered, thinking about how Grace would probably say he wasn't taking this seriously enough. Then a familiar name caught his eye: Sergeant Ryan Doyle. Mike's hand froze mid-page turn. The complaint detailed an incident from 2 years ago. Excessive force used against a 17-year-old black teenager during a routine stop. What made his stomach churn wasn't just the incident itself, but the handwritten notes in Doyle's distinctive scrawl, dismissing the complaint as unfounded despite clear evidence to the contrary. "There has to be some mistake," Mike muttered, pulling more files. But there wasn't just one incident. Over the next hour, Mike uncovered a pattern. 5 more complaints, all involving minority citizens, all mysteriously marked as resolved or unfounded, with Doyle's signature at the bottom. In one particularly disturbing case, dashboard camera footage had mysteriously malfunctioned during a traffic stop that left a man with 3 broken ribs. His hands trembling slightly, Mike opened another folder. This one contained internal memos, evidence of Doyle actively pressuring officers to change their statements about incidents they'd witnessed. The man Mike had looked up to, who'd shown him the ropes and bought him coffee just days ago, had been systematically burying evidence of misconduct for years. "Need anything else, Officer Turner?" called Sandra from the records desk. Mike barely heard her. His mind flashed back to all those times Doyle had pulled him aside, giving him advice about how to handle certain situations, the subtle suggestions about which details to include or exclude from reports, the casual comments about protecting the Brotherhood. He'd thought Doyle was teaching him to be a good cop. Now, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of the records room, Mike realized his mentor had been grooming him to be complicit in a system of cover-ups and corruption. The weight of the betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Mike pushed back from the desk, feeling sick to his stomach. The files seemed to stare back at him accusingly, forcing him to confront not just Doyle's actions but his own willing blindness to what had been happening right in front of him. How many times had he looked the other way? How many unofficial warnings had he given at Doyle's suggestion instead of filing proper reports? The questions piled up, each one adding to the knot of anger and shame in his chest. Mike gathered the damning files into a neat stack, his movements mechanical. He needed to confront Doyle, but the thought filled him with dread. What would he even say? How could he face the man who'd shaped his entire approach to policing, knowing what he knew now? He sat there staring at the stack of evidence, feeling more alone than he ever had in the department. The conference room crackled with tension as senior officers faced off against Grace Morgan. Captain Stevens, a veteran of 20 years, stood with his arms crossed, his face flushed with anger. "You're destroying department morale, Chief Morgan." He spat out her title like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Suspending Kemp without even hearing his side? That's not leadership. That's a witch hunt." Mike sat in the back corner watching the confrontation unfold. Several other officers nodded in agreement with Stevens, their expressions hard and unyielding. Grace remained seated at the head of the table, her posture straight and dignified. "The video evidence speaks for itself, Captain. Officer Kemp used excessive force against an unarmed civilian. That requires immediate action." "It's easy to judge when you're watching a clip online," Lieutenant Martinez chimed in. "You weren't there in the heat of the moment." "No, I wasn't," Grace acknowledged, her voice steady. "But I've seen enough to know that maintaining public trust requires swift and decisive action when misconduct occurs." Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd watched the video multiple times now. There was no justifying Kemp's actions, but speaking up meant risking the anger of his fellow officers. "This department has operated just fine for decades," another senior officer argued. "Now you come in here with your reform agenda, targeting good officers." "If by just fine you mean systematically ignoring complaints and protecting officers who abuse their power, then yes," Grace interrupted, her calm finally showing a crack of steel. "But that ends now. This department will be accountable to the community it serves, or it will face the consequences." The room fell silent. Mike could feel the weight of unspoken threats hanging in the air. Several officers exchanged meaningful glances, and he recognized the signs of brewing resistance. Grace stood, commanding attention without raising her voice. "I understand change is difficult, but if we continue to resist accountability, we'll lose what little trust remains between law enforcement and our community. The choice is yours. Adapt and grow or become obsolete." As officers began filing out, their muttered complaints filling the air, Grace's eyes met Mike's. Her gaze held both disappointment at his silence and hope for what he might become. Mike remained in his chair, feeling the gulf between his old loyalties and his growing understanding of what real justice required. The community center's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the packed room. Metal folding chairs creaked under the weight of concerned citizens, their faces a mix of anger, hurt, and cautious hope. Mike Turner stood at the back, his police uniform feeling like a target as dozens of distrustful eyes glanced his way. Grace Morgan took the podium with quiet authority. Her gray hair caught the light as she adjusted the microphone, her dignified presence immediately commanding attention. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I want to start by acknowledging something important. Our department has failed you, not just once, but many times over many years. We're here tonight not just to listen, but to begin the hard work of earning back your trust." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mike shifted uncomfortably, his back pressed against the wall. One by one, community members approached the microphone. A young mother described being pulled over for no reason while her children watched in fear. A college student recounted being roughly handled during a peaceful protest. Each story landed like a punch to Mike's gut, challenging his long-held beliefs about his role as an officer. Then an elderly man in a worn brown sweater stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the microphone. "3 years ago, I was waiting for my granddaughter outside her school," he began, his voice wavering. "An officer accused me of loitering. When I tried to explain, he wouldn't listen. He handcuffed me right there in front of all the parents and children, made me sit on the curb while he ran my ID." Mike's throat went dry. He remembered that day, the call about a suspicious person, his quick assumption of guilt, his impatience with the man's explanations. "My granddaughter saw the whole thing," the man continued, tears welling in his eyes. "She was 7. She still gets scared when she sees police cars." "Yeah." Grace's eyes found Mike in the crowd, but he couldn't meet her gaze. His face burned with shame as the elderly man described every detail of their encounter: the rough handling, the dismissive tone, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. Mike wanted to disappear. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him like a physical force. He had dismissed that incident as routine, just another day on the job. But hearing it from the other side, understanding the lasting impact of those few careless minutes made him feel sick to his stomach. The elderly man finished speaking and walked back to his seat, his shoulders straight despite the pain in his story. Other community members reached out to touch his arm or pat his shoulder as he passed, a silent show of support and shared understanding. The Saturday morning sun filtered through the blinds in Grace's office as she stared at the threatening note in her hands. Her usually steady fingers trembled slightly as she read the words again, each one dripping with malice toward her family. Captain Reynolds stood by her desk, his face etched with concern. "We need to take this seriously, Grace. These aren't empty threats." Grace nodded slowly, her composure intact despite the fear churning inside her. "My grandson's birthday is next weekend." They included details about his school. She carefully folded the note and placed it in an evidence bag. "I won't risk my family's safety." "We'll investigate this fully," Reynolds assured her. "But maybe some distance would be wise, just until we can ensure their safety." Grace pressed her lips together, fighting back emotion. "I'll need to speak with Mike first." Minutes later, Mike entered her office, his face showing confusion at the unexpected meeting. Grace gestured for him to sit down. "Mike, I'm temporarily stepping back from my role," she said directly, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief. "There have been threats made against my family." "What?" Mike leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "You can't just leave. What about everything you started here?" "That's why I need you to continue overseeing the diversity initiative," Grace said firmly. "You've seen the truth in these files, Mike. You've witnessed the pain in our community firsthand." Mike shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "I'm not ready for this. I can't." "You can," Grace interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "You've grown more in these past weeks than you realize. The department needs someone who understands both sides of this struggle." Mike watched helplessly as Grace began gathering her personal items from the desk. Each item she packed seemed to add another pound of weight to his shoulders. The framed photo of her family, the well-worn copy of the Police Code of Ethics, her nameplate. "How long will you be gone?" he asked, his voice smaller than he intended. "As long as necessary to ensure my family's safety," Grace replied, closing her briefcase with a decisive click. "But my work here isn't finished, Mike. I'm trusting you to keep it going." Mike stood by the door as Grace took one final look around her office. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she walked past him, head held high despite the circumstances forcing her departure. The station seemed to hold its breath as she made her way through the bullpen, her footsteps echoing in the unusual quiet. The afternoon light cast long shadows across Mike's kitchen table, where case files and complaint reports lay scattered like fallen leaves. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched as he stared at the anonymous letter for what felt like the 100th time. "Your badge doesn't make you right," the letter read. "It makes you responsible." Mike's fingers traced over a complaint form from 3 months ago. A teenage boy had accused him of excessive force during a routine stop. At the time, Mike had dismissed it as just another troublemaker trying to cause problems. Now, the memory of the boy's frightened face hit him differently. "I was just doing my job," he whispered to his empty kitchen, but the words felt hollow. Another file caught his eye. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman he'd made stand in the rain while he searched her car because she'd matched a description. He remembered her arthritis-twisted hands shaking as she gripped her umbrella. The elderly man's voice from the town hall echoed in his mind. "He made me feel less than human, like I didn't deserve basic respect." Mike pushed back from the table and paced his kitchen. Each step brought another face to mind. The college student he'd roughed up for talking back. The young mother he'd threatened with arrest for questioning why he'd pulled her over. The shop owner he'd dismissed when reporting harassment. His chest felt tight. These weren't just complaints on paper anymore. They were people. People with families, with lives, with dignity he'd stripped away because he could. He picked up his phone, scrolling to Grace's number. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he stopped. She was dealing with threats against her family. Threats that existed because she dared to challenge the very system he'd been defending. Mike set the phone down and walked to his kitchen window. Outside, kids played basketball in a driveway across the street. A woman walked her dog. An elderly couple held hands as they strolled past his house. All these people trusted him to protect them. Instead, he'd been part of what they needed protection from. He turned back to the table, to the mountain of evidence of his failures. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders, heavy but clear. He didn't know how to make things right, but for the first time, he knew he had to try. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mike sat alone in the records room, surrounded by dusty files from decades past. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out another box labeled 1985-1986. The musty smell of old paper filled his nostrils. "It has to be in here somewhere," he muttered, flipping through manila folders. His breath caught when he saw it. "Morgan Grace, case number 86147. The file was thick with yellowed papers and typed reports. As Mike read through the details, his stomach twisted into knots. Grace had been just 19, walking home from her part-time job at the library. The arrest report claimed she matched the description of a robbery suspect. But the stark inconsistencies jumped out at Mike immediately. The suspect description hadn't matched Grace at all except for her race. Then he saw the signature at the bottom of the report. Officer Ryan Doyle. "No," Mike whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be right." But there it was in black and white. His mentor, the man who'd shown him the ropes, had arrested Grace on completely fabricated grounds. The evidence was clear. Doyle had known the real suspect had already been caught across town, but he'd arrested Grace anyway. Mike's hands shook as he read Grace's statement from back then. "I kept telling him they had the wrong person. He wouldn't listen. It was like I wasn't even human to him." The charges had been dropped 3 days later, but the damage was done. Grace had spent 2 nights in jail, lost her job, and had to explain the arrest to her family and friends. The humiliation and injustice of it all blazed through her written words. Mike thought about all the times Doyle had lectured him about trusting your gut and maintaining authority. He remembered how Doyle had warned him about Grace when she first arrived, painting her as someone with an agenda against the department. He knew, Mike realized, bile rising in his throat. He knew exactly who she was when she came back as chief. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Mike's chest. Every piece of advice Doyle had given him, Every story about the good old days. It all took on a darker meaning now. Mike had modeled himself after a man who'd abused his power and never faced consequences for it. He closed the file with trembling hands and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling tiles. The truth sat heavy in his stomach like a stone, but alongside the disgust and disappointment, he felt something else stirring. Determination. Mike's patrol car pulled up to the station as the chants grew louder. His heart raced at the sight before him. Over 100 protesters filled the street, their signs bobbing above the crowd like angry waves. "No justice, no peace," echoed off the building's brick walls. He barely had time to assess the situation when a new group appeared from around the corner. Counter-protesters, about 30 strong, marched toward the crowd with their own signs defending the police. Mike's stomach dropped as he watched them approach. "This is going to get ugly fast," he muttered, climbing out of his car. Several officers had already formed a line between the groups, but Mike could see the strain on their faces. The air crackled with tension as protesters from both sides began shouting at each other across the divide. "Murderers!" someone screamed from the protest group. "Back the blue!" came the counter-response. Mike watched an officer reach for his pepper spray, and suddenly Grace's voice echoed in his mind. Force should always be the last resort, never the first response. Before he could second-guess himself, Mike stepped forward, positioning himself between the groups. His heart hammered in his chest as he raised his hands. "Everyone, please," he called out, his voice shaking slightly at first but growing stronger. "I want to listen to what you have to say. All of you." The crowd's attention shifted to him, their voices quieting just enough for him to continue. "I know there's anger here. Justified anger," he said, looking directly at the protesters. "We haven't always done right by this community. I know because I've been part of the problem." Murmurs rippled through both groups. Mike swallowed hard but pressed on. "I can't change the past, but I'm standing here now ready to listen. Really listen. Your voices matter, your experiences matter, and things need to change." A woman in the front of the protest group stepped forward. "We've heard promises before," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What makes this time different?" Mike met her gaze steadily. "Because this time we're not just promising change, we're already making it happen. I invite any of you to come to our community meetings, to be part of this process. Hold us accountable, hold me accountable." His words seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. The shouting died down to scattered conversations. Both groups began to separate naturally, the immediate tension dissipating like steam. As Mike watched the crowd slowly disperse, he felt a small surge of pride, not in himself, but in what he'd learned from Grace. For the first time, he'd chosen understanding over force, dialogue over dominance. It felt like a small step, but an important one. Mike stood on Doyle's front porch, his hand hovering over the doorbell. The manila folder containing the evidence felt heavy in his other hand. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button. Footsteps approached and the door swung open. Sergeant Doyle's smile faded as he took in Mike's serious expression. "Mike, everything okay?" Doyle asked, stepping aside to let him in. The living room was neat but lived in, with photos of Doyle's family lining the walls. Mike remained standing, too tense to sit. "I found something in the old case files," Mike said, his voice tight, "about Grace Morgan's wrongful arrest 20 years ago." Doyle's face hardened. "That was a long time ago, Mike. Things were different then." "Were they?" Mike pulled out the documents. "You arrested her for suspicious behavior outside a department store. No evidence, no probable cause, just like what I did to her last week." "I was following protocol," Doyle started. "Don't." Mike's voice cracked. "Don't give me that excuse. You ruined her life, made her spend 3 days in jail for nothing, and then you covered it up." Doyle sank into his armchair, suddenly looking older. "You weren't there, Mike. The pressure we were under. To what? To make arrests? To target people who looked suspicious?" Mike's anger rose. "You taught me everything I know about being a cop, and now I'm realizing that includes all your prejudices too." Silence filled the room. Doyle stared at his hands. "You're right. he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made mistakes, lots of them, and watching you follow in my footsteps," he looked up, his eyes glistening. "I should have done better. Been better." Mike felt his anger deflate slightly, replaced by a deep sadness. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because admitting it meant facing what I'd become," Doyle replied. "It was easier to pretend I was protecting the department, protecting our way of doing things. But Grace was right. We need to change." Mike placed the folder on the coffee table. "Your report ruined her career before it even started. She had to fight twice as hard to get where she is now." "I know," Doyle nodded, shoulders slumping. "And I have to live with that." The station doors swung open as Grace Morgan walked in, her head held high despite the threats that had forced her temporary departure. The morning bustle quieted for a moment as officers noticed her return. Some smiled and nodded respectfully, while others quickly looked away, busying themselves with paperwork. Mike spotted her from his desk and immediately stood up, his heart racing. He'd been rehearsing this conversation in his mind all morning, but now that she was here, the words felt jumbled. "Chief Morgan," he called out, catching up to her as she headed toward her office. "Do you have a moment?" Grace turned, her expression warm but professional. "Of course, Officer Turner. Come in." Once inside her office, Mike couldn't contain himself. "I need to tell you what's happened since you've been gone." He detailed the protest situation, explaining how he'd used her de-escalation techniques to prevent violence. "It worked, just like you showed us. People actually listened when we acknowledged their concerns." Grace settled into her chair, listening intently as Mike continued. "And," he hesitated before pressing on, "I found out about Sergeant Doyle's involvement in your arrest. I confronted him about it." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I've been looking through my own past cases too," Mike admitted, his voice growing quieter. "There's so much I need to make right. I don't know where to start." Grace leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. "Change isn't a destination, Mike. It's a journey that begins with acknowledging our mistakes and committing to do better. You've taken the first steps." "How do you do it?" Mike asked. "Keep pushing forward when there's so much resistance?" "Because every small victory matters," Grace replied. "Every interaction where we choose accountability over defensiveness, every time we stand up for what's right instead of what's comfortable, it all adds up." They stood together at her office window, watching the morning shift change in progress. The station buzzed with activity, officers and civilians moving through their daily routines. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Grace said firmly. Mike nodded, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the strength of purpose. "I'm ready." Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of Grace's office as she and Mike hunched over the proposal draft spread across her desk. Red pen marks dotted the pages where Grace had made suggestions, each one carefully explained to help Mike understand the nuances of policy writing. "Remember," Grace said, tapping the section about community representation, "we need to show how this benefits everyone. It's not just about oversight, it's about building trust." Mike nodded, making another note. His tie felt too tight, and his palms were sweaty. In a few hours, he'd be presenting this to the town council. "What if they just shoot it down right away?" "Then we keep pushing," Grace replied calmly. "Change doesn't happen overnight." Later that morning, Mike stood before the town council, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. The proposal felt heavy in his hands as he began his presentation. "Members of the council, I'm here today to propose the establishment of a civilian oversight board for our police department." He paused, making eye contact with each council member. "This isn't just about monitoring police conduct. It's about creating a bridge between law enforcement and the community we serve." Councilwoman Peters leaned forward, frowning. "Officer Turner, have you considered how the police union might react to this?" "The union's concerns are valid," Mike acknowledged, "but accountability isn't our enemy. I'll be honest, I used to resist the idea of oversight myself, but I've seen firsthand how lack of accountability damages both our department and our community." Councilman Rodriguez nodded approvingly, while others whispered among themselves. Mike pressed on, sharing specific examples of how oversight boards had improved police-community relations in other cities. "This isn't about pointing fingers," Mike concluded. "It's about creating a system where both officers and citizens feel heard and respected." The council chambers fell silent as Mike finished. Grace sat in the back row, her expression neutral but her eyes proud. After several questions from council members, some supportive, others skeptical, the meeting adjourned without a decision. As they walked out of the chambers together, Grace put a hand on Mike's shoulder. "Well done," she said simply. "They didn't say yes," Mike replied, loosening his tie. "No, but they listened. That's where change begins." The station buzzed with tension as Mike returned from the town council meeting. Officers huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations dying as he walked past. He could feel their stares burning into his back. "Turner!" a sharp voice called out. Lieutenant Peterson stormed toward him, face red with anger. "What the hell were you thinking? A civilian oversight board?" Several senior officers gathered around, their expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. Officer Martinez shook his head. "You're throwing us all under the bus, Mike, after everything we've done for you." Mike's throat felt dry, but he stood his ground. "It's not about throwing anyone under the bus. It's about making things better." "Better," Peterson scoffed. "You're giving civilians power over police work they don't understand. This is a betrayal, plain and simple." The confrontation drew more officers, creating a tense circle in the middle of the station. Mike felt sweat beading on his forehead as accusations flew. Grace emerged from her office, her footsteps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted slightly as she approached. "If I may," she said, her voice calm but carrying authority. "This proposal isn't an attack on our department. It's an opportunity to rebuild trust with the community we serve." "With all due respect, Chief Morgan," Peterson countered, "this kind of oversight will cripple our ability to do our jobs effectively." Mike found his voice growing stronger. "At the town hall meeting last week, an elderly man told us about being humiliated during an arrest. I was that arresting officer." The admission brought stunned silence. "I dismissed his dignity because I thought I was just doing my job. That's exactly why we need this oversight, to prevent others from making the same mistakes I did." A few officers shifted uncomfortably, their expressions softening. Officer Chen, a veteran of 20 years, spoke up. Maybe he's got a point. We've all seen things that shouldn't have happened." The tension in the room began to shift. While some officers maintained their hostile stance, others appeared thoughtful, considering Mike's words. Grace placed a supportive hand on Mike's shoulder. "Change is never easy," she addressed the group, "but resisting accountability only deepens the divide between us and the people we're meant to protect. We can do better. We must do better." The group slowly dispersed, some still muttering in disapproval, while others nodded in reluctant agreement. Mike exhaled heavily, feeling drained but resolute. "You did well," Grace said quietly. "Standing up to your colleagues isn't easy, but it's necessary." The station hummed with tension as Mike made his way to the locker room. The usual banter and casual conversations had been replaced by hushed whispers and pointed glares. As he turned the corner, he found himself face to face with a group of senior officers. "Well, if it isn't the department's new golden boy," Lieutenant Peterson sneered. "Come to sell us out some more?" Officer Reynolds slammed his locker shut. "A civilian oversight board? Really, Turner? Thought you were one of us." Mike's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "I am one of you. That's why I'm doing this." "Doing what exactly?" Sergeant Mills stepped forward. "Making us look bad? Giving ammunition to people who already hate us?" Before Mike could respond, Grace's calm voice cut through the tension. "Gentlemen, conference room, now." The officers filed into the room, their frustration evident in every heavy footstep. Grace stood at the front, her presence commanding attention despite her small stature. "I understand there are concerns about the oversight board," she began. "Change is uncomfortable. But what's more uncomfortable is losing the trust of those we're sworn to protect." "With all due respect, Chief," Peterson interrupted, We didn't sign up to be second-guessed by civilians who don't understand our job." Mike felt a surge of courage. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. 6 months ago, I would have said the same thing. But I've seen firsthand how our actions affect people. The elderly man at the town hall, I was the one who humiliated him during that arrest. I never thought about it again, but he's carried that pain for years. The room fell silent. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This isn't about attacking us," Mike continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about making sure we're doing our job right, about rebuilding trust with the community we serve." Officer Martinez, usually quiet during these discussions, cleared her throat. "He might have a point. My sister's neighborhood, they don't even call the police anymore. They don't trust us." Grace nodded approvingly as more officers began to engage in the discussion. Though some remained resistant, the hostile energy in the room had shifted to something more contemplative. As the meeting dispersed, Grace touched Mike's arm. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "But you handled it well. Real change takes time and courage." Mike nodded, exhausted but determined. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders, but for the first time since proposing the oversight board, he felt like he might actually make a difference. Mike sat alone in the records room, surrounded by stacks of complaint files. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across his desk. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. Elena Martinez stood in the doorway, her hands fidgeting with the sleeve of her uniform. She was one of the department's newer officers, someone Mike had barely noticed before. "Officer Turner?" Her voice wavered slightly. "Can I talk to you?" Mike gestured to an empty chair. Elena closed the door behind her and sat down, her posture tense. "I wrote the letter," she said quietly. "The anonymous one you received." Mike straightened in his chair, studying her face. "Why?" "Because someone needed to say something." Elena's voice grew stronger. "I've seen things since I started here, the way certain officers treat people, the complaints that get buried, the excuses we make. It's not right." She pulled out a small notebook from her pocket. "I've been keeping track. Small things mostly, but they add up. The way some officers talk about certain neighborhoods, how quickly they escalate situations that could be handled differently." "Why didn't you come forward directly?" Mike asked. "Would you have listened?" Elena met his gaze. "Before all this, before Chief Morgan, would you have taken me seriously? A rookie questioning how things are done?" Mike felt the truth of her words sink in. Before he could respond, Grace appeared in the doorway. "Elena," Grace said warmly, "I thought I might find you here." Elena stiffened, but Grace's gentle smile put her at ease. "Chief Morgan, I was just—" "Speaking your truth," Grace finished, entering the room and closing the door. "Something we need more of in this department." "I'm scared," Elena admitted. "Speaking up, it could make things difficult." "Change always does," Grace said, sitting down beside them. "But staying silent? That's what allows injustice to continue." Mike watched as Elena's shoulders relaxed, Grace's words giving her visible strength. He thought about how many others might be like Elena, watching, waiting, hoping for change but afraid to speak up. "Your letter," Mike said softly. "It made me think. Really think. About things I'd done. Things I'd ignored." Elena nodded. "That's all I wanted. For someone to pay attention. To acknowledge that we can do better." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Grace's office window as she sat behind her desk, looking more tired than Mike had ever seen her. She gestured for him to close the door. "Mike, I need to be honest with you," Grace said, her usual composure giving way to something more vulnerable. "This fight, it's taking more from me than I expected." Mike settled into the chair across from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her reading glasses. "My grandson's birthday was last weekend," she continued. "I missed it because I was dealing with threats against our family. My daughter wants me to retire, to step back before—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "The stress is affecting my health too, my doctor's concerned." Mike leaned forward, surprised by this glimpse of Grace's personal struggles. "Chief, I had no idea." "Grace," she corrected him softly. "Just Grace right now." She stood and walked to the window, arms crossed. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. If one person can really change a system this resistant to reform." "You already have," Mike said firmly. "Look at me. A month ago I was part of the problem. Now—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You showed me what real leadership looks like, what integrity looks like. You made me question everything I thought I knew about being a good officer." Grace turned back to face him, a hint of her usual strength returning to her expression. "The Oversight Board proposal," Mike continued, "the diversity initiative, the community meetings, they're working. Slowly, but they're working. Elena coming forward, other officers starting to speak up. That's because of you." "And you," Grace added. "You've stepped up in ways I hadn't dared hope for." They spent the next hour discussing strategies for maintaining momentum with the reforms, considering contingency plans if Grace needed to reduce her role. Mike took detailed notes, asking questions and offering suggestions with a confidence that surprised them both. "Maybe," Grace said thoughtfully, "success isn't about winning every battle ourselves. Maybe it's about inspiring others to carry on the fight." The morning sun glinted off the podium's metal surface as Grace Morgan stepped forward, her presence commanding attention from the gathered crowd. News cameras clicked and whirred while community members and officers stood in distinct groups, their body language tense but expectant. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began, her voice steady and clear. "Today marks a significant step forward in our department's commitment to accountability and transparency. The proposed Civilian Oversight Board represents more than just policy change. It represents our dedication to earning back the community's trust." She outlined the key points of the proposal, emphasizing how it would benefit both the department and the community. Her words carried weight, born from decades of experience and recent challenges. When Mike stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembled slightly. He took a deep breath, looking out at the familiar faces of his colleagues and the community members he'd once viewed with suspicion. "A few months ago, I arrested our interim chief during a traffic stop," Mike began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I made assumptions based on bias, acted without proper cause, and contributed to the very problems we're trying to solve. That incident was just one example of my mistakes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mike continued, "I've learned that being a good officer means more than enforcing laws. It means acknowledging our mistakes, understanding the impact of our actions, and working to do better." As Mike shared more specific examples of his past misconduct and his journey toward understanding, several community members nodded in recognition. An elderly man, the same one who had spoken at the town hall, wiped tears from his eyes. The press conference transformed into something more intimate as others began sharing their stories. A young black woman described a positive recent interaction with an officer who had clearly been influenced by the new training initiatives. A veteran officer admitted to his own growing awareness of unconscious bias. Throughout it all, Grace stood beside Mike, her presence a steady reminder of the leadership that had made this moment possible. The local media captured every moment, their cameras focusing on the genuine interactions between officers and community members. As the formal portion concluded, people lingered in small groups, officers and civilians mixing in a way that would have seemed impossible just months before. Mike watched it all, feeling something shift inside him, a sense of finally finding his true purpose in law enforcement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the station windows as Mike organized paperwork at his desk. He looked up, startled, when Sergeant Ryan Doyle cleared his throat. "Got a minute?" Doyle asked, his usual confidence replaced by an unfamiliar hesitation. Mike nodded, following Doyle to an empty break room. The coffee maker hummed in the background as they sat across from each other at a small table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Doyle began, running a hand through his graying hair, "about what you said during our last conversation, about Grace's arrest, about everything." Mike remained silent, studying his mentor's face. The lines around Doyle's eyes seemed deeper than usual. I want to speak at the next town council meeting, Doyle continued, in favor of the oversight board. Mike's eyebrows shot up. You what? Look, I know it probably sounds crazy coming from me, but watching that press conference today, Doyle shook his head. The way you owned up to your mistakes, it got me thinking about my own. Grace appeared in the doorway, catching the tail end of Doyle's words. She stayed quiet, observing the exchange. How do I know this isn't just another way to undermine the proposal? Mike asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Because I'm tired, Mike. Tired of carrying the weight of wrong decisions. Tired of pretending the system doesn't need fixing. Doyle's shoulders slumped. What happened with Grace? That's been eating at me for years. Maybe it's time I did something about it. Grace stepped forward. Having a senior officer publicly support the proposal could make a significant difference, she said thoughtfully. Especially someone with your years of experience, Ryan. Mike glanced between them, weighing the potential impact against his lingering doubts. You'd really be willing to stand up in front of the council and support this? Yes, Doyle replied firmly. It's time for change. Real change. After a moment's consideration, Mike extended his hand across the table. Doyle grasped it, the handshake carrying the weight of their shared history and possible future. As Doyle left the break room, Mike felt Grace's reassuring hand on his shoulder. Sometimes, she said softly, change comes from unexpected places. Mike watched his former mentor's retreating figure, hope and skepticism battling in his chest. The town council chambers buzzed with energy as community members packed the rows, many holding handmade signs demanding accountability. Their chants echoed off the high ceiling. Reform now, reform now. Mike Turner stood near the entrance with Grace Morgan, his hands fidgeting with his prepared notes. Despite weeks of preparation, his stomach churned with nervous energy. You're ready for this, Grace said quietly, giving him a reassuring nod. The council president banged her gavel, calling the meeting to order. The chants died down to expectant silence as Mike approached the podium. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, he could see the council members' faces, some open and interested, others already wearing skeptical frowns. 6 months ago, Mike began, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger. I would have been the last person to stand here supporting this proposal. I was part of the problem, blind to my own biases and resistant to change. He shared his journey, from his wrongful arrest of Grace to his gradual awakening to systemic issues within the department. His voice cracked slightly as he described the elderly man's testimony at the town hall. We need this oversight board, he concluded firmly, not just for the community's trust, but for our own integrity as officers. Before the council could respond, Sergeant Ryan Doyle stood up from his seat in the back. Madam President, if I may speak. The room tensed as Doyle approached the podium. Many knew him as a staunch defender of the status quo, and whispers rippled through the crowd. I've served this department for 27 years, Doyle began, his weathered face serious. And for most of that time, I thought I was protecting it by resisting change. I was wrong. The whispers died as Doyle continued, his voice thick with emotion. Years ago, I wrongfully arrested a young woman named Grace Morgan. I told myself I was following protocol, doing my job. But the truth is, I let my biases cloud my judgment. That woman now leads our department with more integrity than I've shown in my entire career. Gasps and murmurs filled the chamber. Several council members leaned forward, clearly surprised by this unexpected testimony. This oversight board isn't a threat to good policing, Doyle said firmly. It's a chance to rebuild trust and hold ourselves accountable. I urge you to approve it. The community room at the police station had been transformed for the evening. Simple decorations adorned the walls, and a small podium stood at the front. Officers mingled with community leaders, their usual formality replaced by genuine warmth. At the center of it all stood Grace Morgan, accepting handshakes and kind words with her characteristic dignity. Mike Turner watched from near the refreshment table, amazed at how many officers who had initially resisted Grace's reforms now approached her with respect. Even some of her harshest critics seemed to have had a change of heart. Captain Reynolds clinked his glass, drawing everyone's attention. "If I could have everyone gather around, Officer Turner has a few words he'd like to share." Mike's heart raced as he stepped up to the podium. He pulled out his notes but then tucked them away, deciding to speak from the heart instead. "When Grace first arrived at our department, I was the officer who arrested her," Mike began, earning a few knowing chuckles from the crowd. "I thought I knew everything about being a good cop back then. I was wrong." He paused, meeting Grace's eyes. "Grace showed me what real leadership looks like. She taught me that true strength isn't about power or control. It's about having the courage to face hard truths and the wisdom to learn from them." Grace's usual composed expression softened as Mike continued. "She could have let my mistake define our relationship. Instead, she saw it as an opportunity to teach and guide me. That's who Grace Morgan is. Someone who turns obstacles into stepping stones for positive change." Several officers nodded in agreement, and Mike noticed a few wiping away tears. "Grace didn't just push for reform on paper. She showed us what reform looks like in action. She taught us that accountability isn't a threat to good policing. It's essential to it." Mike's voice grew thick with emotion. "I stand here today a better officer, and more importantly, a better person because of Grace Morgan's leadership. And I know I'm not the only one." As applause filled the room, other officers and community members began sharing their own stories of how Grace had impacted them. Each testimony painted a picture of a leader who had transformed their department through both strength and compassion. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Grace's office as she carefully packed her personal items into a cardboard box. Her fingers lingered on each memento: awards, photographs, and letters from community members whose lives she'd touched. The room felt different now, emptier but somehow fuller with possibility. Mike knocked softly on the doorframe. "Need any help, Chief?" Grace smiled warmly. "Not Chief anymore, Mike. Just Grace." As Mike helped her pack, they worked in comfortable silence, both aware of how far they'd come. Grace paused at a photo of her first day as interim chief, remembering the tension and resistance she'd faced. "You know," she said softly, "when I first came here, I wasn't sure anything would change. But looking at you now, Mike, I see hope for real transformation." The station's main conference room buzzed with anticipation as Chief Sarah Martinez was introduced. Her firm handshake and direct gaze commanded respect, while her warm smile put officers at ease. Grace and Mike sat together, watching as the new chief outlined her vision. "The foundation Grace Morgan built here is strong," Chief Martinez declared. "We'll continue pushing for transparency, accountability, and community trust. These aren't just buzzwords. They're our roadmap to better policing." During a break, Grace pulled Mike aside. "The diversity initiative needs someone who understands both sides of the divide," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "Someone who's walked the path from resistance to understanding. That's you, Mike." Mike nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "I won't let you down, Grace." "I know you won't," she replied simply. Later, Grace stood in the parking lot, her box of belongings in her car. She watched through the station windows as Mike and Chief Martinez discussed plans, their shared commitment to reform evident in their animated conversation. With a satisfied nod, Grace slipped into her car and drove away, leaving behind a legacy of change in capable hands. Mike sat at his desk early Wednesday morning, reviewing a fresh complaint that had just landed in his inbox. His coffee grew cold as he read through the details. Officer Peterson had allegedly used excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The complainant, a young Hispanic woman, had provided cell phone footage of the incident. His first instinct was to handle it quietly, the old way. But Grace's voice echoed in his mind. Transparency builds trust. "Sarah," he called to his assistant, "get the team in here and contact Ms. Rodriguez. Tell her I'd like to meet with her this afternoon." Within the hour, his office was packed with department staff. Mike stood, feeling their eyes on him. "We have a serious allegation to address," he began, laying out the details. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, but Mike pressed on. "We're going to handle this by the book. Full investigation, complete transparency." "That'll just stir up trouble," Lieutenant Hayes protested. "These things usually blow over." "Not anymore," Mike cut in firmly. "That's the old way. We're better than that now." Throughout the morning, Mike coordinated with Internal Affairs, ensuring they had everything needed for a thorough investigation. He personally reviewed the body camera footage and cell phone video, taking detailed notes. That afternoon, he met with Ms. Rodriguez in the community center rather than the station, wanting her to feel safe and heard. She sat rigidly across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "First, I want to apologize for your experience," Mike began. "I've reviewed the footage, and I understand why you filed this complaint." Her surprise was visible. I didn't expect that." "We're doing things differently now," Mike explained, outlining the investigation process and the steps being taken. "You'll be kept informed at every stage. Your voice matters here." Word spread quickly through the community about Mike's handling of the case. When he left the community center, several residents approached him, sharing their own stories and concerns. He listened intently, taking notes, making connections he'd missed before. Back at the station, he noticed a shift in how the officers regarded him. There was respect in their eyes, not the fearful deference they'd shown to previous leaders, but genuine appreciation for his clear, principled approach. As he wrapped up the day's paperwork, Mike thought about how far he'd come from that traffic stop with Grace. The memory no longer filled him with shame, but served as a reminder of why this work mattered. The setting sun painted long shadows across the quiet streets as Grace Morgan drove through the town one final time. Her hands rested loosely on the steering wheel as familiar landmarks passed by. The community center where heated meetings had unfolded, the park where protesters had gathered, the coffee shop where she'd mentored Mike through his transformation. The radio hummed softly in the background. In local news, the announcer's voice caught her attention. The police department's recent reforms continue to draw national attention. The newly established Civilian Oversight Board approved last week is being hailed as a model for departments across the country. Grace allowed herself a small smile. The path hadn't been easy. The threats, the resistance, the long nights wondering if change was possible. But here was proof that persistence could overcome even the most entrenched systems. She passed the elementary school where she'd been wrongfully arrested as a teenager, the incident that had set her on this path decades ago. The memory no longer carried its sharp sting. Instead, she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her pain had transformed into purpose. Outside the police station, Mike Turner stood watching her car approach. Their eyes met briefly as she drove past, and she saw in his expression everything that didn't need saying: gratitude, respect, and most importantly, determination. Through her rearview mirror, she watched Mike's figure growing smaller. He remained straight-backed and resolute, a far cry from the defensive young officer she'd first encountered. The sight filled her with hope, not just for him, but for all the officers who might follow his example. The radio continued its report. Community leaders praised the department's new transparency initiatives, citing improved relationships between law enforcement and residents. Mike watched Grace's car disappear around the corner, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Her mentorship had changed more than just his career. It had transformed his understanding of justice, accountability, and what it truly meant to serve and protect. He stood there a moment longer, remembering her words from their first real conversation. Change starts with those brave enough to admit they need to grow. At the time, he'd dismissed her as naive. Now, those words served as his compass. With one final look at the empty street, Mike turned and walked back into the station, ready to continue the work Grace had started. If you enjoyed the story of Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.